Hey, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going back 162 years ago to the very beginning of hostilities of the Civil War. On April 11th, late in the evening on the 11th, a day before the war began, a lone steamer rigged with brigantine sails and bristling with armaments is speeding on a collision course towards Charleston Harbor. It's a sleek, state-of-the-art side wheeler named the Harriet Lane, slicing through the coastal waters with all the grace of her namesake, the young lady, the niece, and the White House hostess of her bachelor uncle, President James Buchanan, who is now out of office and replaced by Abraham Lincoln. Meanwhile, as the Harriet Lane is moving through the Atlantic towards a date with destiny in Charleston Harbor, alert lookouts in the harbor defenses spot the Harriet Lane on the horizon, and they shoot two red rockets and a blue flare into the night sky. It's a signal to the batteries that an enemy ship is approaching. The war is only hours away at this point. That ship, the Harriet Lane, is one of the best known American ships on active duty. She was with the Revenue Service, which today is the Coast Guard. Her able commander is pictured here, the very popular John Faunce, who had been associated with the Harriet Lane from reconstruction in 1857, just a few years earlier. So it is a brand new, it is a state-of-the-art ship. He takes charge as the original captain in 1858. And together, John Faunce and the Harriet Lane embark on a series of adventures. They're on a force sent to Paraguay to seek redress for the firing on a U.S. warship. The ship, the Harriet Lane, is on the Atlantic coast looking for illegal slave traders. In 1860, just a year before the war, the Harriet Lane transports the teenaged Prince of Wales from Washington, D.C. to New York on a memorable trip that makes news across the nation. This is the future King of England. There's a description around this time of John Faunce and how he feels about the Harriet Lane. And the quote is simple and beautiful. He loves her as his life. That's how strongly he felt about the ship. So while this is going on, the bitterly divided, polarized United States is descending to the brink of war. South Carolina secedes from the Union on December 20th, 1860. The Buchanan administration ponders its options. One of the thoughts it has is to send reinforcements down to Charleston. This is around January 2nd of 1861. The rumors are saying that John Faunce and the Harriet Lane are going to be sent on the mission, but it doesn't work out. Instead, another ship, the Star of the West, is sent from New York City to Fort Sumter on a resupply mission. And those of you who know the prehistory of Fort Sumter know that the ship, the Star of the West, is sent back without accomplishing the mission. So 3 months later, Faunce and the Harriet Lane are sent to Charleston Harbor. So on April 8th, just a few days before the bombardment begins, the Harriet Lane is in the harbor of New York. It hauls down the Revenue Marine Service flag, which was part of the Treasury Department at that time, and it's temporarily transferred to the U.S. Navy. Faunce opens up his orders because he doesn't know what they are, and he learns then that he's headed for Charleston. He knows what's going to happen. Flash forward a few days later, the Harriet Lane arrives outside the harbor. Those rockets have been shot into the air by the rebel defenders along Charleston Harbor. She's waiting. The Harriet Lane is waiting for action. Meanwhile, a pair of South Carolina Navy steamers, the Clinch and the Seabrook, are trolling the harbor looking for federal troops and ships and all of that. While that's going on, The Harriet Lane is out there. All the ships are staying apart. There's no activity going on. There's no hostilities. Of course, on the shore, the rebel batteries are preparing to fire on Fort Sumter. Early in the morning of April 12th, the Federal steamer, a second Federal ship, joins the Harriet Lane. This is the Baltic, arriving about 3 a.m. The Baltic and the Harriet Lane flash lights. They alert each other of their positions, and they begin coordinating their activities. Then a third ship, about 6 a.m., a third Federal ship, the Pawnee, shows up. The commander of the Pawnee is Stephen Rowan. The commander of the Baltic, the commander of the Pawnee, Rowan, and Faunce all get together and they have a conversation. And at this point, Rowan famously says, "Hey, I'm not going to be involved in inaugurating a civil war. So we're going to keep our powder dry and we're going to just monitor the situation." All three men go back to their ships and they're waiting to find out what happens next. So they pull up near the edge of the harbor. They're waiting for the action. And then it happens. The firing begins. Captain Faunce, one report says, as we neared land, heavy guns were heard and the smoke and shells from the batteries, which had just opened fire upon Sumter, were distinctly visible. So there's Faunce and the Harriet Lane. The Pawnee and the Baltic are all on the edge of the harbor, and in front of them is the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and they're watching helplessly as the cannon shot from the batteries in Charleston Harbor is beginning to pound the walls of Fort Sumter. So all this is going on, and at this moment, a ship comes by. It's in low mist is on the Atlantic Ocean, the harbor. A ship comes by, a nice looking ship, but it has no ensign flying. This is about 11:20 in the morning. Meanwhile, the bombardment is going strong. John Faunce, the captain, and the crew of the Harriet Lane, they go to battle stations. They send a signal for the vessel to show her colors and stop. The ship does not respond and keeps going. Faunce sends an order to his second lieutenant in charge of the bow gun, a man named Daniel Tompkins, and says, fire on that vessel, send a warning shot, only a warning shot. Tompkins obeys the command, fires a shot across the bow of this ship, and some historians, many historians in fact, credit this event as the first naval shot fired during the war. So John Faunce is now part of history because he issues the order to fire a warning shot across the bow of this ship, which has no colors flying. Turns out that this is a merchant steamer named the Nashville, and the Nashville crew hauls up the Union ensign, so the American Stars and Stripes, so all appears good. And the Nashville crosses and keeps going into the harbor while the bombardment of Fort Sumter is going on. The Nashville eventually docks and the Confederates take control of the ship and turn her into a cruiser. Meanwhile, the bombardment is going on. Faunce on the Harriet Lane, the Pawnee, and the Baltic observe. They see what happens. They eventually leave and they return to other duties and other missions. Faunce and the Harriet Lane go on to participate in a number of operations, including one of the earliest amphibious operations of the war along the coast of North Carolina against the batteries of Hatteras Inlet. That's in the summer of 1861. And not long after that, the Harriet Lane is transferred by the Revenue Marine Service to the Navy for a longer term. Faunce is an officer in the Revenue Marine Service. So he and the Harriet Lane part ways. The ship that he loves so much is now part of the Navy, and Faunce is still an officer in, which is essentially the Coast Guard. So the man, Faunce, and his ship go their separate ways. The Harriet Lane goes on to be captured in and around Galveston, Texas in 1863. You can only imagine how Faunce felt when he got the news that his beloved ship was captured. The Lane was badly damaged. It was repaired and became a blockade runner called the Lavinia. So it's now a Confederate blockade runner, the Lavinia. She makes a successful run, goes out in 1864, gets through to Cuba, where Spanish officials detain her until the end of the war. The Harriet Lane remains in Cuba until 1867. At that point, Spain turns the Harriet Lane back to the United States government. The poor Lane is in bad condition. She's been ravaged by the elements, battered by the rigors of war, scuttled by an 1865 fire that was rumored to have been started by a disgruntled Confederate crew member. The government does something pretty dramatic. The man that they send to recover the Harriet Lane, you guessed it, it's none other than John Faunce. So in 1867, Faunce goes to Cuba, takes control of the ship, which is in horrible condition, gets her seaworthy, and takes her to New York. So there's quite a reunion that goes on when Faunce gets the Harriet Lane to come back to New York. Although she is seaworthy, the government does an evaluation and they decide this ship is going to be way too expensive to fit out for active duty. So they sell the vessel to a merchant in Boston who renames the ship the Elliott Ritchie. So now the Elliott Ritchie, formerly the Harriet Lane, former Lavinia, is now a cargo ship. And she continues in active service in the Merchant Marine until May of 1884, when a hurricane force wind blows her off course in the Caribbean. The crew is forced to abandon ship, and she's somewhere out there right now. The death of the ship makes news across the United States. One of my favorite headlines say, "Goodbye, Harriet, the last of a once famous vessel." By this time, 1884, Faunce had been retired from his service, his career in the Revenue Service. And later on, he had moved to the Pacific Coast, the Atlantic Coast, and the Great Lakes on various duties. But by 1884, he was done. He was retired. A few years later, in 1891, actually on June 5th, 1891, the 50th anniversary of his appointment to the Revenue Service, Faunce is on the lawn of his home in Jersey City, New Jersey, laying out a croquet set with his son. He and his family were about to have a sporting game of croquet when he is hit by a pain in his side. His family rushes to his side, but he was unconscious, has massive heart attack, and he dies about 5 minutes later. He was 85 years old. He outlived 2 wives and the Harriet Lane. So there you have it, the story of John Faunce, the captain of the beloved Harriet Lane. He was there in the beginning of the Harriet Lane's life. He was there on April 12th, 1861, commanding the Harriet Lane on the outskirts of Charleston Harbor. After they parted ways, he comes back in 1867 to take the battered remnants of the Harriet Lane back to New York City. He lives for, another 25 years dies on the 50th anniversary of his appointment to the Revenue Service. So, till the next episode, take care.